can you also give us a little bit of how we could use what dialectics, it's another one of these words that gets thrown around a lot, and how it might be relevant? What I've always appreciated from David Harvey is just the idea that dialectics is a way of understanding history as dynamic relationships between things instead of linear causality and progression. That things are actually interacting and building on each other and creating dynamic situations in a non-linear way.
Right. Well, Hegelian dialectics is interesting because it says that any particular concept doesn't ever have can't be substantiated on its own.
Right.
So, like, if you want to understand a law, for instance, you have to take into account what the violation of the law is at the same time. That that opposites are reinforcing each other, like being and non-being are in dialectic relationship with each other, or the subject.
David and Matt are in dialectic relationship with each other.
Well, possibly, yeah.
Stare, one drunk, one stoned at their
which
computer monitors. Yeah.
But okay, so if you take that into kind of a materialist analysis, then the dialectic is between it becomes a class struggle between the people who own capital and the people who are exploited.
Right.
And on one side of that equation is the force that will be able to overcome the contradiction that at the moment sustains the relationship. So it's the working class that will be able to overturn the capitalist relationship, according to Marx, because, well, I'm not sure if it's a dialectical reason or not, but it's primarily because as the exploited class, they are, and the class that does the actual material work, they are the class that benefits the least from the relationship and also has the real physical power to transform the world. So they're in a good position to change that relationship. So that's sort of my understanding of dialectics in a nutshell. But then when you get to the level of economics and culture in a dialectical relationship, to be honest, I think that that's an open question. I mean, I don't think that there have been lots of ways that socialists have tried to work out that relationship, but what you've got instead of a consensus there is maybe another dialectical struggle between tendencies on the left. And it's worthwhile to kind of examine those struggles. And frankly, preparing to talk to you today made me realize I want to do a lot more work on this question and more reading and maybe make videos and things, because that's where, and it's been something I've been talking about on the podcast with C. Derek Varn and others, the relationship between base and superstructure. But somehow preparing to talk to you today made me realize that concept of overdetermination and seeing how these things played out historically might be the best way to develop my understanding of a theory as well. This is where you become a historical in the way you theorize, maybe.
I think that makes it's a great place to leave us. And I just think, though, that one of the things that these concepts do help us with, and they actually are helpful for the owning capitalist tagline. And in this sense, I'm being less tongue-in-cheek, which is that instead of for like this, that was actually something, that was a big discourse that came out of 2008 was it, on some level, we all know actually that yes, especially relative to the situation, Wall Street deregulation absolutely did allow for the orgy of speculation and self-dealing and betting against your own investments and housing fraudulent policies by the banks, like all of these just despicable Wall Street practices that like good reporters like Matt Taibbi and others and David Dane have reported on, right? Like we know and can confidently make the argument that the crisis came from Wall Street. And then the right had to look for, oh, no. What it really was actually policies to try to get poor people to own homes and, all of this stuff. And but I think that what these tools allow us to do, though, is to not get caught in those narrow, pedantic debates. Because the reality is like if you're actually taking an overdetermined and a dialectic but materialist perspective that really has an actual understanding of how capital operates, even if you hit a gotcha, like for the wrong reasons, right? So like those attacks on initiatives to support poor ownership of homes by working class people are, totally racialized and disingenuous, and they reverse engineer the problem. It's like, okay, it's not Wall Street pushing for policies for a new area of speculation. It's really the incredible lobbying power of poor families in Washington. Like, we know that's a ridiculous, disingenuous argument. But that being said, even if they were able to say, hey, this actually is a policy mechanism here that contributed to the crisis, and maybe they scored some relative small point. If we're not just fighting on the narrow margins of what was the particular specific causal relationship of this or that regulation, but we're actually talking about the real structure of how Wall Street actually operates on the economy as a whole, then those kind of gotcha small games don't work nearly as well, because we're really talking about how the whole goddamn engine operates.
Yeah, and can I say something about that specific example? Because it's a really good one. So, like, if you think that the financial crisis the economic crisis came from finance, that it was a banking problem, then your solution to that is going to be constrained. Mm-hmm. And you're going to try to use regulations to solve the problem. Also, though, you are, as you say, more open to the attack from the right, who might be able to point out some very real policies that created a situation where there were incentives to give loans to people who really couldn't afford them.
Right.
Now, the truth of that was it wasn't those policies that were primarily responsible for that, but the weakness of the banks and the incredible amount of speculation and corrupt practices that swept through the financial sector that made a lot of those loans happen. It wasn't just, some liberal senator who was a bleeding heart, who made that happen.
Right, of course.
But but the other thing is, like, why were the banks in such a weak state to begin with? Why was it that it was so difficult for so many people to afford to buy a home? What was going on in the housing market that created this inflated value of mortgages? Why did the property prices go up so high? And
why do we have a rentier class that that transfers wealth through inheritance, and property is totally concentrated along class and racial line? What were the origin policies of how we make capital work in this country?
Right. And as you dig on those questions, which aren't always immediately obvious, you can come up with a analysis where you can see a problem which is inherent to our social system as it is. I mean, it's basically inherent to capitalism. And that's what happened. That's what I did over several years with a podcast, by interviewing a lot of economists and talking about it and reading Marx and so on. I, came to believe in the theory of the declining rate of profit and Marx's theory of exploitation and labor theory of value, all of which helped me get a better handle on at least that particular incident, the recession of 2008, which, by the way, at the time and for several years later, I thought would be all I ever needed in terms of my radical politics. Like, I could explain that, and that would lead to revolution. People understood that the source of the economic crisis was, especially just right around the time of Occupy Wall Street. I thought that's what we need. Then we can take the power and we can form new kinds of forms of production, take over the factories and create utopia. But now I'm realizing that, the system's ability to paper over crisis and to transform it into something else, like a political crisis instead, is pretty profound, and that, you can't stop at one level of analysis, and that there's a reason why Marxists in history have delved into cultural analysis along with the economics that Marx gave us in the Capital. And I think that, but you have to have both, and I think that it's a very good idea to understand Marx's primary theories from Capital's volumes 1, 2, and 3, and then bring in more analysis from other realms and try to figure out the way an economic crisis can influence the culture or the political situation.
We're coming with the apple cider. We're coming with the apple cider. You can hear it.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson.
Oh, boy. Oh, that apple cider is coming, bro. This is all going to be in the book. Imagine a book that counteracts Sam Harris on any number of levels, but including with an idea of a fully globalized enlightenment, borrowing from ideas from Amartya Sen, and also has an actual accounting of Marxism. I think that there might be years before Jordan Peterson gets any sleep. And Sam Harris is going to get so taken out of context, his head's going to spin.
Yeah.
I'm sure that will be clipped by literalist idiots out there. Doug Lain, publisher of Zero Books, host of the Zero Books podcast. Please check him out. It's a brilliant show, brilliant work. Also, Doug, you have 2 short story collections that you wanted to talk about with regards?
I just want to mention them because they're relevant. I collected short stories around 9/11 a few years back. In 2015, it came out, which were short stories that were written by science fiction and fantasy writers in response to the attacks of 9/11. And it was my way of trying to reimagine what the impact of that had been culturally and politically, and get other people's work to become part of my own work. So by rearranging it and curating it, I made my own message out of other people's stories. And the same thing is true with the second collection, which was called Deserts of Fire, which looked at just the modern warfare from the U.S.-centric perspective, and has some really great short stories in that collection as well, starting with short stories written in response to the Vietnam War and ending with stories written in response to 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq.
Douglas Lain, thanks a million as always. Talk to you soon, brother.
All right, talk to you soon.